The kindergarten teacher who travels through time and falls in love while searching for a lost artifact. Chapter 1, The Ripple of Time. The morning light streamed through the windows of Little Star's kindergarten, casting a warm glow on the brightly colored walls covered in crayon drawings. Yoon Miho, the slightly clumsy but adored kindergarten teacher, bustled around the classroom, preparing for the day. Her students, a lively group of 5-year-olds, would soon arrive, bringing their boundless energy and endless questions. Miho adjusted her glasses and straightened a stack of construction paper when a small, round device on her wrist emitted a faint chime. She glanced down, her breath hitching. The familiar sound meant only one thing, a call from the National Museum. With a quick glance around to ensure no one was watching, Miho pressed a hidden button on the device. A holographic screen flickered to life, displaying the face of Professor Lee, the museum's head of historical preservation. "Miho, we've got another mission," Professor Lee said, his voice calm but urgent. "A priceless artifact, the lunar pearl, has vanished from history. If it's not restored to its proper place in time, it could have catastrophic consequences for our present." Miho sighed, her mind racing. She loved her quiet life as a teacher, but her unique ability to travel through time often pulled her into the museum's orbit. The thrill of these missions was undeniable, but they always came with their share of dangers. "I'll be there," she replied, her voice steady despite the flicker of nerves. The museum briefing. By late afternoon, Miho stood in the sleek, high-tech briefing room of the National Museum. The air buzzed with tension as holograms of ancient artifacts hovered in the air. Professor Lee explained the mission in detail. The lunar pearl, a mystical artifact from the Joseon dynasty, had disappeared from its rightful place. Without it, a series of historical events would unravel, altering the course of history. Miho's task was clear: travel to the year 1592, locate the artifact, and ensure it returned to its rightful owner. Just as she was absorbing the gravity of her mission, the door to the briefing room slid open, and in walked a tall, enigmatic man with sharp features and an air of authority. "This is Park Ewan," Professor Lee introduced him. "He's an expert in artifact retrieval and will accompany you on this mission." Miho bristled. She had always worked alone on these missions, and the idea of a partner, especially one as aloof as Park Ewan, didn't sit well with her. "I don't need a babysitter," she said, crossing her arms. "And I don't need someone who trips over their own feet," Ewan retorted, his voice cool and detached. The tension crackled between them, but Professor Lee waved a hand to silence them. "You're both here because you're the best at what you do. You'll need to trust each other if this mission is to succeed." Reluctantly, Miho and Ewan nodded, though the animosity between them was palpable. The journey back. Miho and Ewan stood side by side on the museum's time travel platform, each clutching a small device calibrated to the year 1592. The room hummed with energy as the machine powered up, the air shimmering with light. "Try to keep up," Ewan muttered, casting a sidelong glance at Miho. She shot him a glare. "I don't need your help." In the blink of an eye, the room around them vanished, replaced by the bustling streets of 16th-century Korea. The sights and sounds of the Joseon dynasty unfolded before them: market vendors calling out their wares, children playing in the dirt, and nobles walking with an air of authority. Miho took a deep breath, marveling at the vibrant world around her. But there was no time to lose. The lunar pearl was out there, and every second they delayed risked altering history further. A fragile alliance. Their first lead brought them to a small village on the outskirts of the capital. Miho relied on her natural charm to gather information, chatting with locals and piecing together clues about the artifact's last known whereabouts. Ewan, meanwhile, remained distant, his piercing gaze scanning the crowd for any sign of danger. Despite his standoffish nature, Miho couldn't help but notice his sharp mind and attention to detail. As they followed a trail of rumors to an abandoned temple deep in the forest, their fragile alliance was put to the test. The temple was said to be cursed, and the villagers warned them against entering. "Still scared, Mr. Expert?" Miho teased, trying to lighten the mood. Ewan smirked. "I've faced worse." Tried to keep straightened her glasses and spoke in a hushed tone. "Professor, you do realize I have a classroom full of toddlers to teach, right?" Professor Lee gave her a small, knowing smile. You always say that, Miho, but you've never let us down. Besides, this artifact isn't just any relic, it's tied to a pivotal moment in history. We need your skills. Miho rubbed her temple. Fine. Just give me the coordinates and the time period. Professor Lee's face grew more serious. That's the tricky part. We have limited information about the artifact's exact location, but we've pinpointed it somewhere in 15th century Korea, during the reign of King Sejong. You'll need to find someone with ties to the court. Be careful, this mission could be dangerous. Before she could argue, the holographic screen vanished. Miho sighed and looked at the clock. She had 3 hours until her students arrived. The leap to the past. Miho activated her time travel device and felt the familiar pull as the room dissolved around her. The sensation of falling and weightlessness was disorienting, but she had done this enough times to remain calm. Moments later, she landed with a soft thud in a dense forest. The sound of rustling leaves and distant voices reached her ears. Miho brushed off her hanbok, a traditional Korean dress that had replaced her modern clothes upon arrival. She always found the automatic wardrobe adjustment fascinating. She stepped out of the forest, her gaze falling on a bustling village. Farmers worked the fields, children played with sticks, and merchants called out their wares. The scent of roasted chestnuts and fresh rice filled the air. As Miho made her way toward the village, she noticed a man standing near a wooden cart. He was tall and striking, with sharp features and an air of authority that contrasted sharply with the dusty roads around him. His black robes suggested he was someone of importance, possibly a court official. Their eyes met, and Miho felt a chill run down her spine. The man approached her with measured steps. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice cold but laced with curiosity. Miho's heart raced. I'm just passing through." The man raised an eyebrow. Passing through? In attire that suggests noble birth? You're either lost or lying. Before she could respond, a commotion erupted in the marketplace. Miho turned to see a group of armed men storming through, shouting about a missing artifact. Her stomach dropped, this wasn't part of the plan. The man beside her grabbed her wrist. "You're coming with me. Now." An uneasy alliance. Miho found herself seated in a quiet room in what appeared to be a modest but well-guarded estate. The man who had taken her, now introducing himself as Park Yuan, seemed to be analyzing her every move. "Who are you, and what are you looking for?" Yuan demanded, his piercing gaze unrelenting. Miho hesitated. She couldn't reveal her true identity as a time traveler. "I'm a historian. I'm searching for something called the Lunar Pearl. It's important to my research." Yuan's expression darkened. "The Lunar Pearl is no ordinary object. It holds power that some would kill to possess. If you're after it, you're in far more danger than you realize." Despite his aloof demeanor, Miho sensed a flicker of concern in his tone. "Why do you care?" she asked cautiously. Yuan hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Because the artifact you're looking for has ties to my family's legacy. If it falls into the wrong hands, it could alter the balance of power in the court, and beyond." Miho leaned forward. "Then we want the same thing. We should work together." Yuan scoffed. "You expect me to trust a stranger with secrets I've spent years protecting?" Miho met his gaze with determination. "You don't have to trust me, but you can't do this alone. And whether you like it or not, I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, silence filled the room. Then, reluctantly, Yuan nodded. "Fine. But if you betray me, you won't live long enough to regret it." The first clue. Their uneasy alliance led them to a hidden chamber beneath an ancient shrine, where they uncovered their first clue, a scroll detailing the Lunar Pearl's last known location, a ceremonial hall in the royal palace. As they deciphered the text, Yuan couldn't help but notice Miho's quiet determination and sharp intellect. She wasn't just a lost noblewoman, she was far more capable than she appeared. Meanwhile, Miho began to see cracks in Yuan's cold exterior. His knowledge of history and his protective nature hinted at a deeper story, one she was determined to uncover. But as they pieced together the mystery of the lunar pearl, a shadow loomed over them. Someone else was searching for the artifact, and they were willing to stop at nothing to claim it. Their journey had only just begun, but already the stakes were higher than Miho had anticipated. Trust was fragile, danger was imminent, and time was running out, literally. Chapter 2: A Delicate Alliance. The moon hung high in the sky as Miho and Yuan navigated the twisting corridors of the royal palace. The hallways, dimly lit by flickering torches, echoed with the sound of their footsteps. Miho couldn't help but feel the weight of history pressing down on her. Every stone seemed to hum with centuries of secrets. "So, what's the real reason you're here?" Miho asked, trying to break the silence. "You said the lunar pearl has ties to your family. But you haven't told me how." Yuan's expression remained stoic as he walked beside her, his dark gaze scanning their surroundings. "It's complicated," he replied curtly. "My ancestors were once guardians of the lunar pearl. But the artifact's true power is dangerous. It's meant to be kept hidden." Miho raised an eyebrow. "Dangerous? How? I thought it was just a lost piece of history." Yuan's lips tightened, and his tone softened just slightly. "It's more than that. The lunar pearl isn't just an artifact, it's a symbol of power. Whoever controls it controls the throne. That's why it must stay lost." Miho's mind raced. Power over the throne? If what Yuan said was true, then the stakes were far higher than she had anticipated. She wasn't just racing against time, she was racing against forces that would reshape history if they found the artifact first. "We need to find it before they do," Miho said, her voice steady despite the growing tension. "Do you have any leads on its location?" Yuan paused in front of a large wooden door, his fingers brushing against the intricate carvings. "The scroll we found earlier mentioned a place known as the Hall of Ancestors. It's said to be where the lunar pearl was last kept, but no one's been allowed inside for centuries. It's hidden deep within the palace, and guarded by more than just royal soldiers." Miho nodded, her heart pounding with excitement and trepidation. "Then we'll have to get inside. Together." The Hall of Ancestors. Hours later, Miho and Yuan stood before a massive stone door, hidden deep within the palace. The Hall of Ancestors was more than just a room, it was a cryptic sanctuary, protected by magic and secrecy. The door itself seemed to shimmer with an ethereal glow, as if the building itself was alive. "Are you sure we can get through?" Miho asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. The scroll didn't exactly provide a clear path. Yuan ran his fingers over the door's surface, his eyes narrowing in concentration. "It's a matter of unlocking the ancient seal. It's not about force, it's about understanding the history behind the magic." Miho stood back, watching him as he muttered under his breath, his hand tracing the symbols on the door. She was used to the feeling of mystery in the air, but this felt different, darker somehow, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for something. Suddenly, with a low groan, the door creaked open, revealing a vast chamber beyond. The air was thick with the scent of incense, and the room was dimly lit by flickering candles. At the center of the room, on a pedestal, lay a stone chest, ornate and ancient. The chest seemed to hum with power, its surface covered in carvings that matched the ones on the door. Yuan stepped forward cautiously, his eyes locked on the chest. "This is it. The lunar pearl is inside." Miho's heart raced, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. There was a presence in the room, something lurking in the shadows. As Yuan reached for the chest, Miho instinctively grabbed his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "Something's not right." Before Yuan could respond, a cold, chilling laugh echoed through the room, making the hairs on Miho's neck stand on end. She spun around, her eyes scanning the dark corners. A figure stepped out from the shadows, tall, cloaked in black, with a glint of malice in their eyes. "I knew you'd come for it," the figure sneered. "But you're too late." The unexpected threat. Miho's breath caught in her throat. The figure before them was cloaked, but there was no mistaking the dangerous aura that surrounded them. They were a threat, someone who had been waiting for this moment, just as Miho and Yuan had been. Miho began, her voice steady despite the fear creeping into her chest. Who are you? The cloaked figure removed their hood, revealing a sharp, calculating face. It was a face she had seen only in passing, a face that belonged to someone in the palace court. I am Jaiwo, the figure said, his voice cold. A loyal servant of the king. And I've been guarding the lunar pearl for years, waiting for fools like you to try and take it. Yuan tensed beside Miho, his eyes narrowing. You're working for the king? Jaiwo's lips curled into a smile. Oh, I don't work for the king. I work for myself. The king is merely a means to an end. Miho's heart raced as the pieces began to fall into place. This was no simple treasure hunt. The lunar pearl wasn't just a relic, it was a key to power, and Jaiwo was determined to claim it for himself. The stakes had just gotten even higher. Yuan stepped forward, his voice calm but forceful. We've come this far, Jaiwo. You won't stop us from taking it. Jaiwo laughed again, a dark, hollow sound. You think you can stop me? You'll never leave this room alive. With a flick of his hand, the room seemed to shift. Shadows twisted around them, and Miho's senses tingled. Something was wrong, this was no ordinary enemy. Yuan's gaze met Miho's. He was ready to fight, but they were both outnumbered and outmatched. They had come for the lunar pearl, but now, they were fighting for their lives. To be continued. As the shadows closed in, Miho realized just how much was at stake. The lunar pearl was more than just an artifact, it was a weapon. And the key to unraveling a mystery far deeper than she had ever anticipated. Her journey through time had only just begun, and with it, a love that seemed destined to evolve into something much more complicated. Would they be able to find the artifact before Jaiwo, and what other secrets would the past reveal? The adventure was only getting started. Chapter 3: The Shifting Tide of Time. The room seemed to warp around Miho as the shadows stretched and pulsed, reacting to Jaiwo's command. She could feel the oppressive weight of the magic in the air, ancient and suffocating. The lunar pearl, which had once seemed like a mere relic, now felt like the epicenter of a storm that could change everything. Yuan, standing resolutely beside her, tightened his grip on the sword at his side. His calm demeanor remained unchanged, but Miho could sense the tension in his muscles. They were dealing with more than just a treasure hunter. Jaiwo was a man with power, and that power was tied to the very room they stood in. You should leave now, Jaiwo said with a malevolent smile, his eyes glittering with cruel amusement. The king will deal with you himself. Or perhaps, you'd prefer to stay and watch the world crumble with your futile attempts? Miho's mind raced. She knew they couldn't leave without the pearl, but fighting Jaiwo in such an environment wasn't a guaranteed victory. As she scanned the room, her eyes flicked to the stone chest at the center, now glowing ominously as though it were reacting to Jaiwo's magic. The chest, the lunar pearl, was still their goal, but now it felt more like a dangerous lure, tempting them deeper into the trap. We're not leaving without it, Yuan said, his voice resolute, though his eyes never left Jaiwo. Jaiwo raised an eyebrow, his hands flexing. You think you can just take it from me? I control the shadows here. This is my domain. Before Miho could respond, the shadows surged forward, like living things, wrapping around their ankles and wrists. The room seemed to close in on them, the air thick with dark energy. Focus. Yuan shouted, slashing through the nearest tendrils of shadow with his sword. Miho, we need to get to the chest. Now. Miho nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt the oppressive magic tugging at her, but she forced herself to concentrate. With a deep breath, she closed her eyes and reached for the one power she knew she could rely on, the ability to manipulate time. Time slowed. The shadows seemed to freeze in midair, the room now a suspended moment in time. Miho stepped forward, her body moving with fluid grace as though the world was now a mere extension of her will. She reached the chest and placed her hands on its cool surface, feeling the pulse of ancient power thrumming beneath her fingertips. But as she reached for the chest, a sudden surge of energy jolted through her, and she stumbled backward, gasping for air. The shadows, once frozen, began to twist violently again, now more furious than ever. I warned you, Jaiwoo's voice echoed in her ears, cold and unforgiving. You can't control time forever. Miho's eyes snapped open, panic rising in her chest as the shadows closed in again. Yuan, fighting furiously to keep them at bay, locked eyes with her. Miho, he called, his voice desperate. The lunar pearl, just inches from her grasp, seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. She could feel its energy, both alluring and terrifying. And then, in that moment, everything clicked. The pearl wasn't just an object of power, it was a key. A key to unlocking the full extent of her abilities. But it came at a cost. If she took it, the balance of time itself would be disrupted. Let me help you, Yuan said, his voice low but urgent, sensing the gravity of the decision she was about to make. Miho hesitated for a heartbeat, but in that moment of clarity, she realized something. She had come here with one goal, to protect the future. The past was a shattered puzzle, but the future? It was a blank slate, one she could still influence. She didn't have time to waste. With one final push, she reached for the pearl, her fingers brushing against its smooth surface. The moment her skin made contact, a blinding light erupted from the chest, filling the room with an overwhelming surge of energy. Time snapped back into place, the shadows retreating in an instant. Jaiwoo staggered back, clutching his head as the light engulfed him. No. You fool. You don't know what you've done. Miho, still trembling from the intensity of the surge, held the pearl in her hands. She felt its power now coursing through her, alive, dangerous, and almost overwhelming. Yuan stood beside her, his eyes wide with shock and awe. You did it, Yuan said, his voice reverberating with both admiration and caution. But at what cost? Miho shook her head, still reeling from the force of the pearl's energy. She didn't know what the cost was. All she knew was that the path ahead was now irrevocably changed. The future was hers to shape, but it was no longer a future she could control with ease. I don't know yet, she whispered. But I can feel it. Something's changed. And we're not done yet. To be continued. The lunar pearl, in her hands, now seemed like both a blessing and a curse. Miho had unlocked its power, but in doing so, she had unknowingly set off a chain of events that would forever alter the course of history. And with Jaiwoo's cryptic warning still lingering in the air, Miho knew their journey was far from over. As the last traces of light faded, Miho looked at Yuan, who was watching her with a mixture of awe and apprehension. There was no turning back now. Together, they had crossed into a world where time itself could bend, and with it, the future they had once hoped to control. But at what cost would this journey through time come? And more importantly, who would they become in the end? Chapter 4, Unraveling the Threads of Time. Miho stood frozen, her hands still gripping the lunar pearl as its energy pulsed in her palms. The room, once so heavy with tension and shadows, now seemed eerily still. Yuan remained beside her, his posture tense as he cautiously observed the scene. The oppressive weight of Jaiwoo's presence had vanished, leaving an unsettling silence that seemed to stretch for miles. But Miho wasn't focused on the stillness around them. Her mind was racing, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the pearl's energy coursing through her veins, a power so immense that it felt like she was tapping into something far older than time itself. What happened? Miho's voice was barely a whisper, her throat dry from the surge of magic she'd just experienced. Yuan's sharp gaze never wavered from her. You tapped into its power, he said quietly, his voice laced with awe and concern. The lunar pearl. You used it to stop the shadows and control time. But be careful, Miho. Power like that comes with consequences. Miho's fingers curled tightly around the pearl, feeling its heat against her skin. She had known that using its power would have a price, but she hadn't expected the feeling of being consumed by it, like her very essence was tethered to something ancient and untouchable. It felt like she had opened a door to a vast expanse of time itself, and she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to close it again. Consequences? Miho repeated, her voice shaky. What kind of consequences? Yuan's face darkened, his brows furrowing as he turned his gaze toward the now empty space where Jiwoo had once stood. The sinister figure had disappeared along with his shadows, but the air still felt charged with the remnants of his magic. "We don't know yet," Yuan said, his voice low. "But what we do know is that Jiwoo is not just an ordinary man. He has been manipulating time for years. And now, with the pearl in your hands, things will only get more complicated." Miho's thoughts raced back to the moment when Jiwoo had confronted her. His cryptic warning echoed in her mind. "You can't control time forever." She shivered, realizing that Jiwoo had known more about the pearl's power than she had. And now, with the pearl's energy still pulsing through her, she wasn't sure who or what she could trust. "Do you think Jiwoo will come after us again?" Miho asked, trying to steady her breathing. "We don't even know what he's after." Yuan gave a grim nod. "He's not done with us. Not by a long shot. The lunar pearl is just one part of a much bigger puzzle. Jiwoo wants to control time, to reshape history to his will. And now that he knows you have the pearl, he'll stop at nothing to take it from you." Miho's grip tightened around the pearl, her eyes narrowing with determination. She wasn't going to let Jiwoo control her, or the future. Not again. "We can't let him win," Miho said, her voice firm, the resolve in her chest hardening like steel. "I won't let him destroy everything we've worked for." Yuan met her gaze, his expression softening slightly. "And I'll stand by you, Miho. But we need to be careful. Time is no longer a linear path. We've crossed into a world where the past, present, and future collide. We don't know what consequences our actions will have." Miho nodded, her thoughts swirling. She knew Yuan was right. The future was no longer clear, and every decision they made would ripple through time in ways they couldn't yet predict. But she couldn't stand idly by while Jiwoo sought to rewrite history for his own gain. Not when the lives of so many people were at stake. As if on cue, a soft crackling sound broke the silence. Miho turned toward the doorway of the room, her heart leaping into her throat. The shadows began to twist again, but this time, they weren't just around them, they were swirling in the air, gathering in front of the chest where the lunar pearl had been. The pearl's light flickered violently, as if it were reacting to the magic swirling around them. "No." Miho muttered, her voice full of dread. "It's happening again." Yuan immediately stepped in front of her, his sword drawn and ready. "Get behind me. I'll handle this." But Miho didn't move. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. If Jiwoo was somehow pulling the strings, there was no telling what kind of dangers awaited them. With the lunar pearl in her hands, she could feel the flow of time once again becoming unstable. The magic was spiraling, and they were in the eye of the storm. The shadows swirled faster, and from the heart of the darkness emerged a figure she never expected to see again. "Jiwoo," Miho whispered, her breath catching in her throat. But this time, it wasn't just Jiwoo who stepped forward. Behind him, a figure in a dark cloak appeared, its face obscured by shadows. Miho's heart skipped a beat when she recognized the familiar shape of the figure's frame. It was someone she had seen before, but someone she had trusted. Someone who had always been by her side. It was Jiwoo's accomplice, the one who had once seemed like an ally, but now stood with him in opposition. "Miho," the figure said, its voice cold and calculating. "Did you think you could control time without consequences? You should have known better." Yuan's sword was already raised, but Miho felt a chill run down her spine. This was no longer just a battle for the lunar pearl. It was a battle for their very lives, and the future of time itself. To be continued. Miho's world was shifting, as if time itself were slipping through her fingers. Her journey had only just begun, and with every step forward, she found herself confronted by greater and more dangerous forces. The pearl had unlocked something much darker than she had anticipated. And now, with a trusted ally turned foe, she had to navigate through the treacherous web of alliances and betrayals that spanned across time. What consequences awaited Miho and Yuan? Could they stop Jiwoo and his mysterious ally from rewriting history? Only time would tell. Chapter 5: The Shifting Sands of Time. The air in the room grew heavy with tension as the mysterious figure, her former ally, stepped forward, revealing a smirk beneath the dark cloak. Miho's mind raced, her pulse quickening with dread. How could someone she trusted, someone who had shared so many secrets with her, now be standing with Jaiwoo, the very man who sought to manipulate time itself? Why? Miho breathed out, her voice barely a whisper, her mind struggling to piece together the shattered trust she had once placed in this person. Why are you doing this? The figure tilted their head slightly, their eyes gleaming with cold indifference. Because, Miho, you were always too naive to see the bigger picture. Time has always been malleable, and with the right tools, the right power, I can reshape it however I want. Miho's stomach churned as she realized the truth. The betrayal had been planned long before Jaiwoo had ever shown up in her life. She had been a pawn, a tool in a larger game she couldn't even begin to comprehend. But the pearl, it's not meant for this. Time shouldn't be controlled by anyone, Miho protested, her voice gaining strength as she stepped forward, her grip tightening around the lunar pearl. The figure laughed softly, a cruel, hollow sound. You really don't understand, do you? The lunar pearl is only the beginning. With it, I can control every moment in history. I can rewrite the past, erase mistakes, and mold the future into something more useful. Yuan, who had remained silent up until now, shifted into a defensive stance, his sword gleaming in the dim light. You won't succeed, he said firmly. Time is not something to be tampered with. You'll destroy everything if you keep going down this path. Miho could feel the weight of the pearl in her hands, its power urging her to act, to defend herself and those she loved. But the darkness before her seemed impenetrable, as if every movement, every decision she made, would set off an irreversible chain of events. The figure, now revealed as an accomplice of Jaiwoo, took another step toward them, the shadows swirling around them like a cloak of danger. You really think you can stop me? You've already played your part in the game. Now, it's time for the endgame. Miho's heart pounded as she glanced at Yuan, the man who had become more than just a guide in her journey through time. Despite everything, she couldn't lose hope. We have to stop them, Yuan. We can't let them control time like this. Yuan's eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, everything else faded. The swirling darkness, the sense of impending doom, they all seemed to quiet as their gazes met, as if in that instant, they both understood the gravity of what was at stake. Not just the future, but their lives, their love, their very existence. We will stop them, Yuan said, his voice resolute. I swear it. And then, without warning, the darkness surged forward, the figure lunging at them with inhuman speed. Miho barely had time to react, but the pearl responded instinctively, its power flaring in her hands as she thrust it forward. The burst of energy sent the figure staggering backward, but it wasn't enough to stop them completely. Jaiwoo, ever the shadow, moved in the periphery, his presence still looming, unyielding. You think you can fight destiny? Jaiwoo's voice echoed in the chamber, dark and foreboding. This is a war you can never win, Miho. Miho, struggling to control the overwhelming power of the pearl, turned to Yuan. We have to find a way to stop them, now. Yuan nodded. We'll have to go back to where it all started. Back to the source of the pearl's magic. It's the only way to neutralize the threat and stop Jaiwoo and his ally from rewriting history. Miho's heart skipped a beat. The source of the pearl's magic. She had never thought about it, but now it seemed like the only option. The answer, the key to everything, was buried deep in the past. But with Jaiwoo and his accomplice closing in, and time itself unraveling around them, they didn't have much time to waste. Let's move, Yuan said urgently, grabbing her hand. We don't have a moment to spare. Together, they ran, pushing through the maze of shifting time, determined to find the heart of the pearl's power. But as they moved forward, a sinking feeling crept into Miho's chest. What if the source of the pearl's magic was more dangerous than they could ever imagine? What if, by trying to stop Jaiwoo, they were setting into motion something far darker and more uncontrollable? The answers were waiting in the past, but at what cost? Chapter 6, The Heart of Time. Miho and Yuan's journey led them through a strange and twisted version of time itself. It felt as if they were drifting between worlds, each one more fragmented and unstable than the last. The walls around them seemed to pulse with an eerie light, flickering like a dying flame, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to tear apart. "Where are we?" Miho asked, her voice tinged with unease. Yuan looked around, his expression grim. "We're close. The source is somewhere beyond this point. But we have to be careful, this is the heart of time. Any wrong step, and we could be lost forever." Miho swallowed hard. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, but she couldn't. Not now. Not when everything they had worked for was hanging in the balance. They pushed forward, their footsteps echoing through the silence. The further they went, the more distorted the world around them became. Time, once a linear path, now felt like a twisted web of possibilities, each moment layered on top of the next, impossible to untangle. Finally, they arrived at a cavernous chamber, the air thick with an unnatural energy. At the center of the room, a massive, glowing orb pulsed with an ancient, almost primal power. It was the source, the very heart of the pearl's magic. Miho's heart skipped a beat as she stared at the orb. It was beautiful, yes, but there was a darkness within it, a pull that threatened to consume everything. "This is it," Yuan said softly, his hand tightening around his sword. "We have to destroy it before Jaiwu or anyone else can harness its power." Miho nodded, her gaze locked on the orb. She could feel the weight of her choices bearing down on her. Destroying the orb would stop Jaiwu, but at what cost? Would they be able to restore time to its natural flow, or would their actions have far-reaching consequences? As Miho reached out toward the orb, a cold, menacing voice stopped her. "You can't undo what's already been done." Miho turned sharply to find Jaiwu and his accomplice standing at the entrance, their faces unreadable. This time, Jaiwu continued, his voice full of malice, "The past will be rewritten. And you, Miho, are the one who will pay the price." Miho stood tall, her grip tightening on the lunar pearl. "No, Jaiwu. This ends now." The final battle for time had begun. To be continued. Miho and Yuan's fate hangs in the balance as they confront the truth about the lunar pearl's power, and their journey through time nears its explosive climax. Can they stop Jaiwu from rewriting history, or will they become lost in the tangled web of time they've unwittingly set in motion? Only time will tell. Chapter 7, The Heart of Time. Miho's fingers brushed the cold surface of the glowing orb in front of her. The energy radiating from it was powerful and overwhelming, its presence pulling at the very core of her being. Every instinct told her to pull away, to run, but her resolve kept her steady. This was the heart of everything, the source of the pearl's magic, the key to stopping Jaiwu and rewriting the distorted future they had stumbled into. Yuan stood at her side, his eyes fixed on the orb with a combination of awe and wariness. He had always been the steady presence beside her, but even he was beginning to feel the weight of the situation. "This is it," Miho whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of uncertainty and determination. "If we destroy it, we stop everything. Or we could set time on a path we can't even begin to understand," Yuan replied, his tone cautious. "But we don't have much choice." Miho nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had come so far, through countless loops of time, encountering betrayal, discovering truths, and ultimately facing the reality of her own powers. She couldn't let everything she had learned and fought for be erased. "I know," she said softly, more to herself than to Yuan. "This has to end." But as her hand hovered over the orb, a sudden coldness swept through the air, sharp and oppressive. She turned to see Jaiwu and his accomplice standing at the entrance of the chamber, their silhouettes framed by the flickering light of the orb. "I knew you'd come here," Jaiwu's voice echoed through the chamber, low and controlled, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "You think you can destroy the very thing that binds time together? You have no idea what you're dealing with, Miho." Miho's heart clenched. The gravity of his words settled on her shoulders like a heavy burden. But she couldn't back down now, not after everything she had learned about herself and the responsibility she carried. "You don't understand," Miho said, meeting Jaiwu's gaze with a quiet defiance. "This isn't about control or power. It's about preserving what time was meant to be. You don't get to rewrite history for your own gain. Jaiwo chuckled, his expression cold and detached. I'm not rewriting history, Miho. I'm shaping it. I'm making it into something better than it ever was. Miho's grip on the lunar pearl tightened, the power of the artifact surging within her. She could feel the orb calling to her, urging her to take control, to make the choice that would end the game. But there was a part of her that hesitated. What if destroying it would cause irreparable damage? What if their attempts to fix time only made things worse? Yuan stepped closer, his presence a comforting anchor in the chaos. Miho, we don't have much time. We have to act before he does. She turned to him, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and fear. I don't know if I can do this. You don't have to do it alone, Yuan said softly, his hand gently brushing hers. We'll figure it out together. In that moment, Miho knew that she wasn't alone. She had Yuan by her side, and together, they could face whatever lay ahead. Jaiwo's voice interrupted the moment, a sharp edge of frustration creeping into his tone. You don't get it, do you? Time isn't meant to be preserved, Miho. It's meant to be controlled. And I'm the only one who understands that. Miho took a deep breath, her decision crystallizing in her mind. She had lived through the loops, the paradoxes, and the confusion. She had witnessed what happened when time was manipulated too freely, how it unraveled, how it lost its meaning. She wasn't going to let Jaiwo play God with the flow of history. Your vision is flawed, she said, her voice steady and unwavering. Time is not yours to control. It belongs to everyone. With one final glance at Yuan, she stepped forward, the lunar pearl glowing brighter in her hands. It was time to end this, once and for all. But as she approached the orb, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble, and a sudden, intense pressure gripped her chest. The power of the pearl surged violently, reacting to her resolve. No! Jaiwo shouted, his hands reaching out in a desperate attempt to stop her. You'll destroy everything. Miho's heart raced, but her mind remained clear. She could feel the shifting currents of time, the fragility of the present, and the weight of her decision. With a final, decisive motion, she thrust the lunar pearl into the center of the orb. There was a blinding flash of light, and the world seemed to collapse in on itself. When the light faded, Miho found herself standing in the same chamber, but everything had changed. The air was still, the oppressive weight of time's manipulation had lifted, and the orb was no longer pulsing with energy. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been reset, returning to its natural flow. Yuan stepped beside her, his expression softening as he took in the changed surroundings. Did we do it? Miho looked down at her hands, the lunar pearl now glowing faintly, no longer radiating the overwhelming power it once had. It was still in her possession, but it felt different now, less dangerous, less consuming. I think we did, Miho whispered, her voice filled with both relief and sorrow. But I don't know if everything's truly fixed. Yuan gave her a reassuring smile, his fingers brushing against hers. We can't fix everything, Miho. But we can make things right in our own way. And maybe that's enough. Miho nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. There was still so much to learn, so much to discover about herself and the world they had just saved. But for now, this was enough. They had made a choice, and together, they had faced the consequences. As they stood in the quiet aftermath of their journey, Miho realized that time, much like their love, was something that couldn't be controlled. It could only be lived, cherished, and embraced for what it was. And perhaps, that was the greatest lesson of all. Chapter 8, The Aftermath of Time. The light from the lunar pearl dimmed, casting soft shadows on the now still chamber. The pulse of energy that had dominated the space was gone, replaced with an eerie calm. Time seemed to have settled, or at least, it appeared so to Miho. Her chest felt lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted, but at the same time, something gnawed at the edges of her mind. Miho turned slowly to look at Yuan, who stood silently beside her. He was gazing at the now dormant orb, his brow furrowed in thought. There was something different in his expression, a quiet sorrow, as if the world had changed in a way that even he couldn't fully understand. Yuan? Miho's voice trembled slightly as she spoke his name. Is it really over? Yuan glanced at her, his eyes softening. He gave her a small, reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. I think so, Miho. I hope so. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. But time is never truly over, is it? Miho's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had thought that by destroying the orb, everything would be set right. Time would reset, and the distortion that had been caused by Jaiwa's interference would fade into nothingness. But now, standing in the quiet aftermath, it was becoming clear that things might not be as simple as they seemed. We've restored the natural flow of time, Miho said, trying to steady her thoughts. But it doesn't feel like everything's back to normal. Yuan nodded slowly, his gaze wandering to the now still orb. Because it's not. The damage that's been done, what Jaiwa started, it's going to take more than just a reset to undo it. The timeline may have been restored, but the scars remain. Miho's chest tightened as she absorbed his words. The timeline had been reset, but the threads of fate, the paths they had traveled, the consequences of their actions, those were still tangled, still unresolved. There were too many questions left unanswered. Too many lives left hanging in the balance. You're right, she whispered. We've only just begun to understand what happened. She looked down at the lunar pearl, still in her hands. Its once overwhelming energy had settled, but it still pulsed faintly, as if it were a reminder of the power they had wielded. The question of what to do with it now lingered in her mind. Could she trust it again? Could she even trust herself? Suddenly, a sharp noise broke the stillness, a distant sound, like a crack splitting the air. Miho and Yuan exchanged a look, both of them immediately on edge. Miho's senses sharpened. She felt a familiar, unsettling pull in her chest, an echo of the power she had once felt from the orb. Do you feel that? She asked, her voice low. Yuan's face turned grim. Yes. Something's wrong. Without another word, they moved quickly toward the entrance of the chamber, their footsteps heavy and swift. The quiet that had once settled around them now felt ominous, as though the world was holding its breath. As they stepped outside, the night sky stretched out before them, dark clouds swirling ominously overhead. A storm was brewing, but not in the way Miho had expected. This wasn't a normal storm, it was something far worse. The wind picked up, howling as it rushed through the trees. In the distance, flashes of light danced across the horizon, ripples in the fabric of time. They hadn't fixed everything, not entirely. The timeline was still unstable, and somewhere, something or someone was trying to tear it apart once more. Miho's pulse quickened as she realized the extent of their actions. They had undone Jaiwa's manipulation of time, but the damage he had caused was far deeper than she had imagined. And there was still the matter of the power that had once been in her hands, the lunar pearl. It wasn't just a relic, it was a key. And now, that key was sending out ripples, disrupting the very essence of time. I think we've made a mistake, Miho said, her voice barely a whisper. Yuan turned to face her, his face serious. We didn't have a choice, Miho. You did what you thought was right. But I didn't understand, Miho admitted, a knot of guilt forming in her chest. I thought I could fix everything by destroying it. But now, I think we might have just set something worse in motion. Yuan took a step toward her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. We'll figure it out, he said, his voice firm. We always do. Miho looked at him, seeing the unwavering trust in his eyes. It was then that she realized there was more to their journey than just fixing time. It wasn't just about undoing the mistakes of the past. It was about understanding the consequences of their actions and accepting the uncertainty of the future. With a deep breath, Miho nodded. All right. Let's figure this out. Together. The next few days were a blur of frantic activity. The storm that had descended on the world seemed to grow stronger, the time ripples more intense. Miho and Yuan scoured historical records, consulting ancient texts, and revisiting the places where the disturbances had originated. The lunar pearl's connection to time was deeper than they had realized, and with every step they took, they uncovered more about the artifact's true power. But with each discovery came new dangers. Figures from the past began to emerge, phantoms of history, drawn to the chaos they had caused. Some sought to protect the timeline, while others sought to exploit the cracks they had created. As they journeyed further into the heart of the disturbances, Miho and Yuan grew closer, their bond strengthening. They shared quiet moments between battles, finding solace in each other's company as they navigated the complexities of time and love. Miho knew that they had crossed a point of no return. The timeline was broken, and only they could mend it. But how could they face a future they hadn't even begun to understand? And then, one night, as they stood on the precipice of their greatest challenge, Miho realized something important. The past, the present, and the future, they were all interconnected. They had always been connected. And in the end, their greatest strength would be the choices they made, the ones that would define the future. But for now, they had to survive the storm that was still coming. Chapter 9, The Edge of Time. The storm that had begun as a ripple now roared like an uncontrollable beast, and Miho couldn't ignore the sense of impending doom that loomed over them. The cracks in time weren't just affecting the world around them, they were distorting reality itself. The landmarks they had visited in the past no longer felt the same, the places once familiar to them seemed to blur in and out of existence, as if they were in a world teetering on the edge of collapse. The lunar pearl pulsed intermittently in Miho's hand, its glow faint but unmistakably present, as if it were calling to something, or someone. As if it were waiting for a decision to be made. Miho had seen that look in its depths before, the weight of history, the burdens of decisions that had been made long ago. Yet, in the quiet moments between the chaos, she felt something more. A connection between the pearl, her, and Yuan, a bond stronger than time itself. Miho, Yuan's voice interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to face him. His expression was shadowed with concern, his dark eyes reflecting the turmoil swirling in the air. I don't think we have much time. Miho nodded. The weight of his words wasn't lost on her. They had been running on borrowed time since the moment they disturbed the timeline. And now, with every passing hour, the consequences of their actions became clearer, time was fracturing. We need to find the source, Miho said, determination creeping into her voice. There's a place, at the heart of the disturbance. It's where everything began. If we can reach it, maybe we can reverse the damage. Yuan's gaze lingered on her for a moment, as if he were searching for something in her eyes. Perhaps he was trying to gauge whether she truly understood what they were about to face. I'll follow you wherever you go, he said softly, but there was an edge to his voice. Something unresolved, something unspoken between them. The confession they hadn't yet made. But this wasn't the time for such things. Not when the fate of everything they knew hung in the balance. Miho looked at him, a flicker of understanding passing between them. She wasn't sure if it was the weight of their shared experience, or the growing tension between them, but she felt an undeniable bond that was becoming harder to ignore. She would need him to succeed, and perhaps, in some way, she already had him. Together, they moved through the storm, leaving behind the remnants of the world they knew. The landscape twisted around them, as if reality itself were warping to accommodate the rift in time. With each step, the air grew heavier, colder. The ground beneath them seemed to shift, the once solid earth now like a mirage, unstable. Finally, they reached the heart of the disturbance. A cavernous structure rose before them, ancient and imposing. It was here that time's fractures were most potent, its seams unraveling and reweaving with every passing second. A deep hum filled the air, vibrating through Miho's chest. She could feel it in her bones, the energy that had been unleashed. It was as if time itself were alive here. The lunar pearl pulsed faster in her grip, the light glowing brighter, almost blinding. It was drawn to the structure ahead, as though it were calling them to enter, to confront the very force that had fractured time. This is it, Miho said, her voice barely a whisper. She had no idea what awaited them inside the structure, but she knew they had no choice. It was the only way to fix the broken timeline. Yuan took a step forward, placing his hand gently on Miho's shoulder. His touch was grounding, a reminder of the bond they had formed through the chaos. Are you ready? He asked, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet fear. Miho nodded, taking a deep breath. Let's go. Inside, the structure was eerily silent, the only sound the echo of their footsteps. The walls were covered in ancient inscriptions, glowing faintly in the dim light. Miho ran her fingers over the markings, feeling a strange warmth radiating from them. It was clear that the power of the lunar pearl was connected to this place. As they ventured deeper, they came across a chamber at the heart of the structure. It was empty, save for a large pedestal in the center, upon which sat a dark crystal. The crystal pulsed with an ominous energy, its surface swirling with the same time distortions they had witnessed in the world outside. Miho approached the pedestal slowly, the lunar pearl growing warmer in her hand. She could feel its energy responding to the dark crystal, as though the two were bound by fate. "This is it," she said, her voice filled with awe and trepidation. "This is what's been causing the fractures." Yuan stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "What do we do now?" Miho hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She knew that in order to stop the disruptions, the crystal had to be destroyed. But she also knew that doing so could have unforeseen consequences. The power of the lunar pearl and the crystal were intertwined, and she didn't know if breaking one would completely restore the timeline, or if it would send them further into chaos. But she couldn't let fear stop her now. She had come too far. "I have to destroy it," Miho said, her voice firm with resolve. "It's the only way to fix the timeline." Yuan reached out, his hand resting on hers. "Wait." His voice was soft, but his grip was tight. "There's something else we need to consider." Miho looked at him, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "If we destroy it," Yuan continued, "the lunar pearl might disappear with it. And if that happens, we may not have any way to undo the damage we've done. We might not even be able to return to our own time." Miho's heart sank. She had known that there were risks, but the finality of Yuan's words brought it all into sharp focus. Destroying the crystal would fix the immediate rift in time, but it could also sever their connection to the power that had allowed them to travel through it in the first place. "I have to try," Miho whispered, her resolve hardening. With a final glance at Yuan, she raised the lunar pearl toward the crystal. The two objects hummed with energy, vibrating in sync. For a moment, time itself seemed to freeze, the air thick with tension. Then, with a single, decisive motion, Miho plunged the lunar pearl into the crystal. The world around them shattered. Chapter 10, Shattered Time. The world around them exploded into a brilliant burst of light, then darkened into a vast, inky void. Miho felt as though the very fabric of time had ruptured, stretching and snapping as she was pulled into the unknown. The pain was indescribable, like being torn apart and remade, over and over. The force of the distortion made it impossible to keep her eyes open, but somehow, she could still sense everything, every pulse of energy, every fragment of thought that coursed through her. And then, silence. When Miho opened her eyes, she was no longer in the chamber. The pedestal, the crystal, and the lunar pearl were gone. Instead, she was standing on solid ground, surrounded by an unfamiliar landscape. The air felt strange, heavier somehow, like the very atmosphere was charged with an electric tension. "Yuan," she whispered, her voice trembling. There was no answer. Panic started to creep into her chest. She spun around, searching for him, but there was nothing. No sign of Yuan. The distance between them seemed vast, and for the first time since they had embarked on their journey, Miho felt truly alone. Her heart raced as she took a step forward, scanning the horizon. A mist clung to the earth, thick and swirling, obscuring the path ahead. In the distance, she could make out the outline of a city ancient, yet strangely modern, with towering spires and arched bridges. But the sky above was twisted, clouds roiling as though caught in a storm that would never break. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet shifted. A tremor ran through the earth, and she stumbled. The landscape before her flickered, then snapped back into focus, but something was wrong. The city was no longer there. Instead, a dark forest stretched out before her, its trees gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers into the sky. Miho's breath caught in her throat. She could feel it now, the disruption, the rift that had been caused by the destruction of the crystal. They had torn a hole in time, and now, it seemed, the world was unraveling around her. A voice echoed through the mist, soft yet unmistakable. Miho. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned toward the sound, her body aching to move, but fear rooted her to the spot. The voice was familiar, but she couldn't place it. She had to find Yuan, had to make sure he was okay. Miho. This time, the voice was closer. She recognized the tone, the slight rasp that had become so familiar over the past few weeks. It was Yuan. Miho. His voice broke through the haze, filled with urgency. Where are you? The panic in his voice spurred her into action. She ran toward the sound of his voice, her heart hammering in her chest. The mist seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive, and the ground shifted beneath her, making it difficult to keep her footing. Yuan, she called, her voice strained. She pushed through the dense fog, her feet heavy as she struggled to move forward. Finally, she broke through the mist, and there he was. Yuan stood in a clearing, his expression tense, eyes wide with relief as he saw her. He reached out to her, his hand trembling as if he weren't sure she was truly there. Miho, he breathed, his voice a mixture of relief and disbelief. You're here. Miho collapsed into his arms, overwhelmed by the weight of everything that had happened. She hadn't realized just how much she had needed him until now. The fear of losing him, of being lost in this fractured time, had gnawed at her insides. But now, with him in her arms, everything seemed to ground itself. For a moment, it felt like they were the only two people left in existence. You're okay, she murmured, the words barely more than a whisper. Yuan nodded, his grip tightening around her. I think we're both okay. But, where are we? Miho pulled back slightly, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. I don't know, she admitted. But I don't think we're in our time anymore. Yuan's face darkened. What does that mean for us? Have we, he faltered, his brow furrowing as the implications sank in. Have we changed the past too much? Miho didn't have an answer. The destruction of the crystal had been a risk, and now it seemed that they were caught in the middle of the consequences. Time had fractured, and they had no way of knowing where, or when, they were. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the trees, followed by the rustle of leaves. Miho stiffened, her instincts kicking in. Something was approaching, something dangerous. Yuan, she whispered urgently. We need to move. Now. They turned and started to run, the eerie growls growing louder as something, or someone, pursued them through the forest. The air grew colder, the mist swirling around them as they dodged between the twisted trees. Where are we supposed to go? Yuan asked, his voice laced with panic. I don't know, Miho admitted, her breath coming in quick gasps. But we can't stay here. We have to find a way to fix this, to get back. As they ran, Miho's mind raced. They had destroyed the crystal to fix the rift, but it seemed like their actions had only made things worse. The time they had once known, their world, their past, was slipping further and further away, and they were caught in a place that wasn't even part of the timeline they had once inhabited. The growls grew louder, and Miho's heart pounded in her chest. They couldn't outrun whatever was chasing them. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. Stay close to me, Yuan said, his voice resolute. We'll figure this out together. Miho nodded, the fear subsiding slightly in the face of Yuan's unwavering determination. If there was one thing she had learned during their journey, it was that they were stronger together. And she wasn't going to give up now, not when they were so close. But just as they rounded a bend in the path, a figure stepped out of the mist. It was a woman, tall and imposing, with long black hair that seemed to shimmer with an unnatural glow. Her eyes were dark and calculating, as though she knew everything there was to know about them, and about the forces they were up against. Miho stopped dead in her tracks, her pulse quickening. Who are you? The woman smiled, but it was not a kind smile. It was a smile that spoke of secrets, of knowledge that could shatter everything Miho thought she knew about time, and about herself. I am the keeper of time, the woman said, her voice echoing like a whisper carried on the wind. And I've been waiting for you, Miho. Chapter 11, Unraveling the Threads. Miho's heart raced as the woman in front of them, this keeper of time, smiled, her eyes gleaming with knowing. She didn't seem like a mere figment of the time-bending world. There was something undeniably real and ancient about her, like she had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, seen time itself fold in on itself. "I'm the keeper of time," the woman repeated, her voice echoing with an almost eerie calm. "And you, Miho, have unknowingly disturbed the natural flow of history." Yuan stepped forward, positioning himself protectively in front of Miho. "What do you mean, disturb time?" "We're trying to fix it, to put things right." The keeper's eyes flickered to Yuan, then back to Miho. "Oh, you believe you're fixing things? You don't even understand the cost of what you've done." Miho swallowed, a chill creeping over her. "What cost?" she asked, her voice wavering. "We only destroyed the crystal to stop the rift. We thought it was the only way." The keeper's gaze softened for a moment, as though pitying them. "You've shattered more than just an artifact. You've torn apart the very fabric of time. And now, time itself is fighting back." As if on cue, the ground beneath them trembled, the trees shaking violently. The sky, once dark and ominous, now crackled with bolts of lightning, the storm above them swirling in unnatural patterns. Yuan glanced around in panic. "What's happening? Is this time fighting back?" The keeper nodded slowly. "Yes. The imbalance you've caused will ripple through the ages, distorting everything you know. But what's truly important is what you've unlocked." Miho frowned, confusion taking hold of her. "What are you talking about? What did we unlock?" The keeper took a step closer, her eyes narrowing as she looked at both of them. The crystal wasn't just a tool for time travel. It was a key to a much deeper mystery, one that was never meant to be discovered. Before Miho could respond, the ground beneath their feet cracked open, and a figure emerged from the depths of the earth, cloaked in shadows. The air grew colder, and a dark aura enveloped them. Miho gasped, stumbling backward, her body tense with fear. Who is that?" The keeper's expression hardened. "The one who has been waiting for you both. The one who will stop at nothing to see this disruption undone." The figure stepped forward into the dim light, revealing a face that Miho instantly recognized, a face she had seen countless times before in her dreams, in her visions. It was Yuan. But not the Yuan she knew. This Yuan was different. His eyes were darker, more calculating, and a cruel smirk tugged at his lips. His presence radiated malice, as though he was a stranger wearing the skin of the man she trusted. Miho's breath caught in her throat. What is this? How is this possible?" The doppelganger Yuan's lips curled into a sinister smile. "You've gone too far, Miho. You had your chance to undo the mess you created, but now, there's no turning back. The key has been unlocked, and now the consequences are inevitable." Yuan, the real one, looked between Miho and his doppelganger, confusion and fear evident in his eyes. "No, this isn't me. I don't know him." The shadowy Yuan laughed darkly. "Don't you see? I am what you could have become. I am the version of you who chose power over everything else, who let ambition and desire control the timeline. And now, you will face me, your darkest self, the one who will stop you from ever reaching your goal." Miho's mind raced. This couldn't be real. This had to be some sort of trick, some manifestation of their fractured timeline, but the eerie resemblance was too much to ignore. The weight of his words pressed down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. What had they truly unleashed by destroying the crystal? The keeper stepped forward again, her gaze unwavering as she addressed the dark Yuan. "You are a consequence of their actions, an embodiment of the path they've altered. And you will not succeed. Time is not meant to be controlled, and the two of them will find a way to set things right, whether you like it or not." The dark Yuan's smile faltered slightly, his eyes narrowing. "We'll see about that. Time, like everything else, is mine to manipulate now." A wave of cold air rushed toward them, and the dark Yuan raised his hand, sending a pulse of dark energy crashing toward them. Miho barely had time to react before her Yuan, pushed her out of the way, taking the full brunt of the attack. No. Miho cried, rushing to his side. Yuan's body trembled, his face pale as he struggled to stand. I won't let him win, he rasped, his voice weak but resolute. I won't let you lose everything. Miho helped him to his feet, her heart hammering in her chest. They couldn't afford to let this dark version of Yuan take control. Not when they were so close to fixing everything. The keeper watched them with a mixture of resignation and determination. This is your choice, Miho. Your fight. But understand this, you may have unlocked the key to time's very core, but unlocking it also means facing its most dangerous consequences. There is no turning back from what you've done. You must decide if you will sacrifice everything to restore balance, or if you will allow this darkness to consume you both. Miho turned to face the dark Yuan, her hands trembling as she held onto Yuan's arm. She couldn't let him fall. Not now, not ever. I won't let this happen, she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging around them. I will make things right. No matter what it takes. With newfound resolve, she pulled Yuan closer, steeling herself for the battle ahead. The time-traveling journey had always been a risk, but she was ready to face the consequences. She would fight for the future with Yuan. As the battle began, Miho felt the weight of time itself pressing down on them. But she wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not ever. Chapter 12, The Final Hour. The storm raged around them, lightning flashing as the dark version of Yuan, his face twisted with malice, advanced. Miho gripped Yuan's arm tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. The time-bending forces surrounding them seemed to pulse with every beat, threatening to tear the fabric of reality apart. You can't stop what's already set in motion, the dark Yuan sneered, raising his hand to summon another wave of destructive energy. Time belongs to me now. You're just pawns in a game that's already over. Miho's breath hitched, the weight of his words sinking in. If they didn't stop him now, everything they'd fought for, the hope of rewriting history, of fixing their mistakes, would be lost. There would be no future left, just an endless loop of chaos. Miho, we don't have much time, Yuan murmured, his voice strained. His body was still trembling from the earlier blow, but his eyes burned with determination. We have to close the rift before he gains full control over it. Miho nodded, her resolve hardening. She had already lost so much in this journey, her time, her peace of mind, and nearly her future with Yuan. She wasn't going to let this dark version of him rewrite their destiny. We'll find a way, she said, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. Together, they turned toward the rift, the air growing thicker with each step. It loomed before them, a tear in the fabric of time, a swirling mass of light and shadow. Miho could feel its power vibrating in her chest. If they didn't act soon, the damage would become irreversible. The Keeper of Time, silent until now, stepped forward, her gaze locked on the rift. This is the moment where everything converges, she said softly. You must make a choice, Miho. The rift is not just a force to be reckoned with, it is a reflection of your deepest desires, your regrets, and your dreams. It will pull you in, take you to places you may not wish to visit. But it is the only way to fix what you've broken. Miho's heart skipped a beat. The weight of her decisions over the past few months, her time-traveling mishaps, her choices, her feelings for Yuan, were all about to come to a head. Was she truly ready for the consequences of this final decision? Yuan squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and fear. We can do this together. Whatever happens, we'll face it. The words of the Keeper echoed in Miho's mind. A reflection of your deepest desires, your regrets, and your dreams. Suddenly, a realization hit her like a thunderclap. She had been focusing on the wrong thing. The rift wasn't just a physical tear in time, it was a manifestation of the battle between her and this darker version of Yuan. But more importantly, it was about what they both wanted, the future. She didn't have to fight against time, she had to fight for the life she wanted to build, alongside Yuan. With a surge of determination, Miho stepped forward, her fingers brushing against the rift. The air around her hummed with energy, and the rift rippled, as though it were alive, responding to her touch. You can't control this, Miho, the dark Yuan shouted, fury in his voice. It's already too late. But Miho didn't stop. She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the moment, the connection between her and Yuan, the love that had grown between them, despite the dangers, the twists of fate, and the threats from the past. She reached into the very heart of the rift and, with every ounce of her will, pulled at the strands of time. The light around her flared, blinding, until there was only a single, piercing moment of clarity. And then, everything stopped. Chapter 13, Time Heals. When Miho opened her eyes again, the world around her was eerily still. The storm had dissipated, the air crisp and clear. The rift was gone. Yuan stood beside her, his body no longer trembling from the earlier attack. He looked at her, his eyes filled with wonder and relief. Did we do it? Is it over? Miho looked around, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt at peace. The chaos had ended. The rift was gone. The timeline, restored. But the most important thing was the look in Yuan's eyes. They were full of love, undeniable, unwavering love. The past had been painful, but they had survived it, and now they had a chance to build something new. It's over, Miho said softly, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. We've fixed it. As they embraced, the Keeper of Time's voice echoed one last time in their minds. You've done it, Miho. You've not only saved your future but preserved the delicate balance of time itself. You've chosen the path of love and redemption. With those final words, the Keeper faded into the ether, leaving Miho and Yuan alone in the quiet aftermath of their journey. Epilogue: A New Beginning. Months passed. The world had returned to normal, but for Miho and Yuan, nothing would ever be the same. They continued their work together, not as strangers caught in a time loop, but as partners, learning, growing, and exploring the world together, side by side. Miho had come to terms with her ability to travel through time, but she no longer sought to control it. She knew now that time was something to be respected, not bent to her will. With Yuan by her side, they had built a future free from the shadows of their past. They were finally living the life they had always dreamed of, a life not bound by time but defined by love. The end.